Many Zavud, Mikhail. My name's Mike. I'm your friendly Russian agent, giving you some fake news about Russia and Ukraine. Perhaps not. I used to teach history. The crisis between Russia and the West at the moment is the most dangerous we have ever seen since the darkest days of the Cold War. And much of it revolves around the crisis in Ukraine, and in particular the annexation of Crimea. Since almost no Western media have given any kind of in-depth analysis of what lies behind this problem historically, I thought it might be a good idea just to give you a little bit of background information on why this crisis arose. Russia and Ukraine have been united as one country on and off for more than 1,000 years. The first Russian state was in fact Ukraine. It was founded by Swedish Vikings in the 9th century. A Viking called Rurik first of all founded the town of Novgorod, which is now about 100 miles south of St. Petersburg, though that didn't exist at the time. From Novgorod, his son or his nephew Oleg, it's not sure which, moved the capital south to Kiev, which was further down the river system, which links the Baltic Sea with the Black Sea, and which the Vikings used as their trade route down to the city of Constantinople, which was the head of the seat of the Byzantine Empire that was the greatest empire of that time. The Russian princes of Kiev were converted to Orthodox Christianity by monks coming up from Byzantium, Greek monks, who brought with them not only the Orthodox religion, but also the Cyrillic alphabet, named after one of them, Saint Cyril. The city of Kiev, or rather the Russian state of Kiev, Kievan Rus, became one of the richest and most prosperous and imposing cities in the Western world, the largest and richest city after Constantinople itself. Until in the middle of the 13th century, disaster struck it. The Mongols of Genghis Khan swept through Asia and parts of Europe, and they destroyed Kievan Rus. They destroyed the city of Kiev in 1240. This was almost the end of the first Russian state, because the whole region came under Mongol domination. But the Mongols did not really stay behind to build states, and into the vacuum they left behind came Poland and Lithuania, who divided up most of western and central Ukraine, or what is Ukraine today, between the two of them. The eastern part of Ukraine, on the other hand, remained a kind of no man's land, and into that area fled a number of peasants who did not want to come under Polish rule, because the Poles practiced serfdom, and they tended to force conversion to Catholicism. These people who fled to eastern Ukraine from Polish rule were called Cossacks, and they set up independent villages which they defended with their own armed forces. But Polish incursions into their territory continued. And finally, in the 17th century, the Ukrainian Cossacks made contact with the new Russian state that was arising further east, around Moscow. And they made an alliance with that state to fight against the Poles. The Russians defeated the Poles in battle, pushed them out of central Ukraine into the western provinces, which the Poles continued to hold until the Second World War. And the alliance between Ukrainians and Russians became a virtual union. Ukraine became part of the Russian Empire as it began to expand. Of course, the relationship between Russians and Ukrainians had all the ambiguity of many of the relationships between a centralizing, powerful state and its neighboring peoples who come under its control. You only have to look at the ambiguity of the relations between Scotsmen and Englishmen to see that the English conquest and assimilation of Scotland, Wales, and Ireland left behind very ambiguous feelings towards them. The recent Scottish referendum shows that roughly half the population of Scotland sees the English as a kindred nation with whom they have a shared history, and roughly half sees them as a colonial power who have oppressed them throughout history and from whom they wish to liberate themselves. Very much the same ambiguity existed in relations between Ukraine and Russia. There were no rebellions of any bloody kind to match the rebellion of the Scots at Culloden, but there were, shall we say, frictions. There were periods when the Russian Empire tried to Russify fairly heavily its neighbors, and periods where it let them develop their own culture and languages. In the 19th century, a Ukrainian poet called Shevchenko, who was sent to St. Petersburg to study, began writing poems in his rural dialect, Ukrainian. This was the first time Ukrainian had been raised above the level of a peasant dialect for centuries, and it marked the revival of a national language, which became the center of a nationalist movement, as it did in many parts of Europe at the same time, where various languages which had been lost, forgotten, or denigrated were revived as part of a national independence movement. The same is true very much with the Welsh and with the Irish. And it was certainly true in many other parts of Europe. You have to understand that the colonial relationship between a dominant power and its peripheral neighbors has a whole range of different degrees of oppressiveness. Many of the Welsh and the Scots don't see Britain as an oppressive power, don't see England as an oppressive power. Others do. And that same ambiguity lies in many of the nation states of Europe which have absorbed smaller peripheral peoples. If you look at examples like France and Spain, France is a composition of some 7 separate nations. The French absorbed the Bretons, the people of Aquitaine, the Provençals, the Basque people of Provence, the people of Corsica, the people of Savoy, the people of Alsace-Lorraine, most of which had their own separate languages. And these languages were gradually extinguished by the French by the simple process of beating their children at school if they spoke them. So that France today is a very unified country where there are few serious independence movements. The only one really is that of Corsica. Britain, on the other hand, was rather less oppressive in its, well, shall we say, Britain crushed the languages in Scotland and Ireland, but not so successfully in Wales. Spain, if you take that as a major contrasting country, was far less successful in its centralized oppression, and many of the provincial languages, the regional languages such as Catalan and Basque, remain very much alive. And that is why those Spanish provinces have very vigorous independence movements still today, precisely because they were not exterminated by the central power in the way that the peripheral movements in France were exterminated by the central power. So to see the existence of a regional independence movement, or a movement which tries to fight for national independence from what it considers a neighboring colonial power, is not necessarily the measure of oppression. It is the measure of the lack of success of centralization by that colonial power. You could say France was more ruthless in crushing all peripheral peoples and their sense of identity. Spain was far less successful in crushing them, and therefore Spain has independence problems today which France doesn't have. So the nationalist narrative in talking about the oppression of a larger neighboring people is always to be taken with something of a pinch of salt, because the relationship was generally an ambiguous one, and many people probably lived with the dominance of the neighboring power quite peacefully, quite with a certain amount of acceptance, with a certain amount of resignation that that was simply the reality of the times they lived in much the same way as many Irish poets became, or Irish writers became, celebrated in the English language, the language they wrote in the same way many Ukrainians wrote in Russian. Gogol was a Ukrainian. And in the same way, various people from the peripheral countries managed political success in the dominant power. As Lloyd George, for example, the Welshman, became Prime Minister of Britain. In the same way, Brezhnev, the Ukrainian, became ruler of the Soviet Union. So that there is always an ambiguity in this relationship. It is not simply the extremist narrative that the nationalist movements always recount. But it is true that the development of nationalism in Ukraine became, shall we say, a significant reality in the middle of the 20th century. This occurred because the western part of Ukraine had, as I said, remained under Polish rule. It had been under Polish rule for 500 years, and for 130 years, between the end of the 18th century and the First World War, Poland had actually been partitioned among its neighbors, so that the Polish parts of Ukraine passed into the hands of the Austrian Empire. The Austrian Empire therefore ruled the two provinces of Volhynia and Galicia until 1918, when the Austrian Empire collapsed and these provinces reverted to Poland. Now, with the restoration of Polish rule over those provinces, because they had large Ukrainian populations, Ukrainian nationalism became an extremely virulent force. It was mainly aimed against the Poles, who were the oppressors of those two Ukrainian provinces. And in the mid-20th century, in the 30s to be precise, a movement of extreme Ukrainian nationalism arose in those two western provinces, which were part of Poland. This movement was directed by a man called Stepan Bandera, and he was something of, shall we say, an extremist, an ultra-nationalist extremist, who decided that the Polish populations of those villages should be exterminated if possible, of those two provinces should be exterminated if possible. And during the 1930s, he initiated a program of terrorist attacks on Polish officials. The opportunity came with the Second World War, when first of all, in 1939, that part of Ukraine was occupied by Soviet troops as part of the division of Poland between Hitler and Stalin. And the Soviets cracked down on the Ukrainian nationalists. But then, in 1941, when Hitler decided to invade the Soviet Union, those Polish provinces were occupied by the Nazis, and the Nazis, of course, moved all the way into Ukraine, and they saw the Ukrainian nationalists of Stepan Bandera as more or less, shall we say, allies or potential allies against the eastern part of Ukraine, which was solidly Russian-speaking and solidly pro the Red Army. So that the nationalist movement of West Ukraine, shall we say, the western provinces of Ukraine, formed a kind of alliance with the Nazis. It was a very complex and ambiguous relationship, because initially they proclaimed, the Ukrainians tried to proclaim a state of their own in the western provinces, and Stepan Bandera was arrested by the Nazis for doing this. But in reality, most of the followers of Stepan Bandera and the extreme nationalists made common cause with the Nazi occupation. They had a great deal of complicity among the Nazis, and they were given a free hand to mount a campaign of virtual genocide against the Polish populations of those provinces. So that the Ukrainian nationalists went into Polish villages and murdered men, women, and children, often in the cruelest way imaginable. And they killed up to 100,000 Poles in this way, in order to terrorize the rest of them into leaving those provinces and going to the rest of Poland. In this way, they hoped to cleanse those two provinces, Volhynia and Galicia, of their non-Ukrainian populations. They, of course, exterminated the Jews as well, and prepare them for annexation by a nationalist Ukraine. They were, of course, hoping that the Nazis would win the war and that Ukraine would become independent afterwards. Unfortunately for them, the Nazis lost the war, and the Soviets returned in force into Ukraine, and these nationalists of the Ukrainian nationalist movement had to flee before the Red Army. And of course, many of them went to America and Canada, where you can see that the Ukrainian diaspora is fanatically anti-Russian, simply because they are descended from what you could call the neo-fascists who fought in Hitler's army in the Second World War. We'll stop there for a second. So, what happened